Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I'm your host, Josh Howard, and I'm joined today with another Southern accent, Corey Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, brother. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. It's good to get another Southern draw on this channel. So Corey, we've been wanting to have you on for a while. I've been keeping up with your a lot of the things you've been posting. We're going to get into some of that, but just for those who don't know you, little bio information, where you at, where you serving, where do you hail from?
Yeah, so the accent's actually from Memphis, Tennessee, which we got a
Amen.
little connection there. Grew up in Memphis, but served in at a church in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is northwest Louisiana, a Heritage Baptist Church. So I'm honored to serve as one of the pastors there, and just real thankful for that church. That church was the first place I heard expository preaching. It's the place I was introduced to Reformed theology, covenant theology. We'll get into that and just even just the introduction into it had a huge part in my life. Really grew exponentially spiritually while at this church. I was thankful for the pastors, the men there who mentored me over the years. So, anytime I get to say I get to serve at Heritage Baptist Church, man, it just brings a big smile to my face. I'm thankful for the Lord's work in my life as a member and now as a pastor. So really thankful for that church and thankful for the folks there. And our church is a confessionally Reformed Baptist church. We confess the London Baptist Confession of Faith, 1689. We've been confessionally Reformed Baptists actually since our inception, since 1991, so just over 30 years.
Wow.
Uh, our church is a part of two national association of churches. We're part of the Confessional Baptist Association, or called the CBA, if you've heard of that before. And then we're also part of the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC. We're part of some other local Baptist associations as well. And now I'm married to my high school sweetheart, Hope. We have 4 children. Our children range from the age from 7 to about 3 months. So it's been a fun, full season of life. Definitely don't take it for granted. But I think that pretty much sums me up.
That's fantastic. No, I like two things that you said well, besides the Memphis connection, but I too am married to my high school sweetheart and have 4 kids. So mine are a
Oh,
little bit
okay.
further along than yours because I'm much older, I would assume. I've got a little more gray coming in the beard. But yeah, no, the second thing is just that you serve in a church. I really appreciate that. We love chatting with pastors specifically, because theology that has actual feet to it, when the theology actually hits the ground, when the gears actually start turning on that, it's good to speak to people who are putting their theology into practice. So I'm glad to talk with you about that. You mentioned you're in the SBC. I know you've kept up quite a bit with SBC issues. How goes things in the SBC? I mean, this isn't the topic of the episode, but how
Right.
are things over there?
Man, there's been some great encouragements even over the past year, but the ship still needs to be turned. So I'll just put it that way. So I
Okay.
think, there's like all the other bigger denominations, especially mainline denominations. We've been hit. We've been hit pretty hard with some of the woke stuff, and it's really infiltrated a lot of the institutions, leadership, pastors, and so try and really recover that. I think still the grassroots and majority of the churches are still, rock solid when it comes to just believing the Bible, what the Bible says, and inerrancy of Scripture. And the big thing we're battling right now is just women in the role of pastors and preaching. So there's a big vote coming up this upcoming summer that if it goes well, will have the office of elder would be only for qualified men, and that would be within our constitution and bylaws.
Hmm.
And if that happens, then Lord willing, that could really protect the SBC from getting going further off. Okay, because it's in our statement of faith, but as of now, it's hard to really enforce that, and people have try to have different interpretations of it. But if we're able to get that vote this summer within the Constitution and bylaws, then I think it can really protect the denomination from further slide theologically.
Um,
Because if you don't give up on that, then you're most likely not going to give up on the other things as they come
right.
up.
And that's the same measure, if I'm remembering correctly, that passed last year, and then it has to be, I guess, ratified or whatever this year,
That's right.
repassed to be
Yeah,
official. Okay.
because it's constitution and bylaws. Has to have two votes of the of 2/3 of the people. So we got over last year. I think it was close to 90%. I mean, it's like 89. I mean, it's a pretty high number that voted for it. So hopefully that will happen again. The only thing is, within some of the SBC politics, a lot of the leadership has now kind of put forth another option that will try to lead people away from voting for this measure and voting for something else that really wouldn't accomplish what needs to get done.
Okay.
So we're still kind of in the thicket of it in the
Okay.
SBC.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the SBC is, we were talking before we started recording, Corey, and I'm not in the SBC, but I've been in the SBC. But as the SBC goes, it impacts a lot within evangelical circles, Protestant circles within America generally. So it's good for everybody to keep them in prayer and keep them up to date. We've also had, I would mention, we've had Dave Schrock and the Christ Overall guys. We've partnered with them several times. Founders Ministries, Tom Askell, we're very fond of them. So there's some good folks to keep up with in the SBC. So
yeah, man, so thankful for Founders. They've been huge for the SBC. I think huge just for evangelicalism as a whole. But man, they've really been big just defending, the gospel, especially in the last, 5, 6, 7 years with a lot of the wokeness coming in, and they've done a great job. So I'm so thankful for them. I don't think the SBC would be where it's at if it wasn't for them. So.
Well, let's jump into our topic du jour. So Baptist covenantalism. You made some waves on the Twitter X machine, and have been talking about Baptist covenantalism. I'm fascinated by this one. I've been looking forward to this conversation. But covenantal theology is one of those. It's not just an academic pursuit, right? Covenantal theology has a lot of impact on so many ways that you look at things, particularly, I would argue, with eschatology. When we start getting down to where we have been in eschatology, or where we have moved to, or what we have solidified within eschatology, it almost always becomes a covenantal conversation at some point. So I'm curious, number one, for you to walk through Baptist covenantalism, but maybe as a walk through with that, Corey, if you could just kind of walk everybody through how you arrived at some of your conclusions. I think you kind of intimated earlier that you've been on a little bit of a theological journey. That's true of most of us, right? Where we began in the faith is not necessarily where we land. What's that looked like for you?
Yeah. So, maybe let me give you the journey and then maybe, give some of those definitions. But I was actually saved through a Church of Christ ministry in Memphis. Didn't grow up in a Christian home, was invited to a church youth camp by some friends, ended up going to it. The church camp was actually in East Tennessee, Fall Creek Falls, Tennessee. It wasn't one of those beach reach youth camps, like you're on the beach all day. It was you're in cabins in the woods. You got a strict schedule. There's a lot of preaching, a lot of reading the scriptures, a lot of being out in nature. And the Lord used that time there. They had an on your mark time, which was an hour each day during the week. They gave me a Bible and you got to read through the Gospel of Mark. I said, read through a few chapters each day. It takes only about 10 minutes, and then you got 50 minutes. You're just sitting there. And, the Lord really just used that time. First time reading the scriptures. Remember coming to the end of the Gospel of Mark and being like that centurion saying, yeah, surely this is the Son of God. And I just remember just, trusting in Christ, knowing that there's a God. I mean, I was looking around me, I was sitting by a creek and just looking at the sky, the trees, knowing that there is a God who's created all things. And the Lord saved me then. And then for a couple of years, I attended that church, but didn't really have much of I had a zeal for the Lord, but really didn't have too much theological teaching or discipling. There's a lot of personal holiness, so to speak, in different ways. And it was a good community. But then I ended up moving to Louisiana. And when I came to Louisiana, it was the first time I attended a Baptist church. It was a big Baptist church. It was the first place I went, and was really kind of thrown off by it at first. And then I was invited to a Reformed Baptist church, the church I'm a pastor at now, while I was in late high school, late high school. And I would attend there, and I would come for we have an afternoon service. So we have a morning service in the New Testament. We all eat lunch together. And then we have an afternoon service in the Old Testament. Well, I came to the Old Testament afternoon service, and man, first time hearing expository preaching, the pastor was going through the book of Genesis. And up until that point in my Christian life, the way I read the Bible was I would open it up in the New Testament somewhere, put my finger down, read a verse, close it, think about it, and the Lord's used those in different ways in my life. But it was the first time the pastor was going verse by verse and it's going through a book of the Old Testament. I really didn't know the Old Testament at all. I mean, by that time in my Christian life, I was about 17, 18. If you have asked me who was the one who, got all the animals on the ark, I don't know if I would have been able to tell you, just because I just didn't have that theological, biblical, knowledge. So I started attending this church, and I really thought the Old Testament really wasn't for me. I don't think anybody told me that at the previous churches I had attended, but that's just kind of what I caught. And as a pastor was going through the book of Genesis, I remember first attending there, and 90% of the sermons were over my head. I didn't know what was going on, but I was so hungry because I knew what he was saying was the truth, and he was showing me like from the scriptures. And I remember I would leave the church and go immediately. I mean, I wish we had 5 services. I would go immediately home, was hungry, was reading the word, just looking forward to, the Lord's Day coming up. And really the Old Testament, what stuck out to me was the pastor. He would get to points in the Old Testament. I still remember one sermon that stuck out to me as he's preaching through Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And in it, him pointing to Christ throughout it, with the ram caught in the thicket, with Isaac prefiguring Christ, and in all those ways. And to me, that was the introduction to covenant theology. It was really just reading the Bible as one story, it all connecting, and that was huge for me. And it kind of gave me the courage to say, hey, I can read the Bible for myself too. I can read the Old Testament. Good preaching will show you how to study the Bible. And that really was the introduction. Then as time went by, just being a part of a good, healthy Reformed Baptist church, I just started learning more. And it's really through the preaching, but then also through some of the discipling and reading books together on covenant theology. So it's really through the Reformed Baptist church I was attending, and really the preaching is really what introduced me to it. And it just helped me to see the Bible as just one book.
Right.
And that just helped me. It helped me get the big picture of the Bible, because for so many years as a Christian, I just didn't have the big picture. I had small bits and pieces. I mean, I had the gospel, but I didn't really have much else. And it's hard for me just to understand the Bible at all, to read it. But by sitting under expository preaching, seeing that, being taught that, I was able, covenant theology really was life transforming. To me, that was bigger. It was bigger for me understanding covenant theology than even the doctrines of grace. When I first understood the doctrines of grace, that was huge, but covenant theology, that's when the light bulb went off, where I was like, I can actually read the Bible for myself. And there is this one meta narrative. There is this one sweeping sovereign plan of redemption that God has for his people from Genesis to Revelation. It's one story. So that really was the introduction for me.
Okay. So coming in, Reformed Baptist Church, was that 1689? You said it was 1689 from its inception.
Yeah, from its inception. Right. Yeah, actually, you mentioned founders. Our founding pastor was Tom Askell's older brother.
Okay.
Bill
Very
Askell.
Cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, very cool. So
we started off as a Reformed Baptist church with Southern Baptist ties, but always a kind of like a founders type church within the SBC. We've always had that sort of DNA as a church.
Okay. So explain then, for those who aren't, because this can get, maybe I'm slow, but it seems it can get a little bit tricky to differentiate between these two, especially if somebody is not familiar with covenant theology on the Baptist side of things. What would differentiate your take on Baptist covenantalism from, for example, a 1689 Federalism, or let me let you walk us into that. How is this a unique sort of view?
Yeah. So the term a term we kind of came up with recently, just 1689 covenantalism. And the reason we use that term is because there was in the last, I think since about 2000, I think it was 2014, in the last 10 years, there's been this view on covenant theology that's been published and taught within Reformed Baptist circles called 1689 Federalism. But that's really only happened, like I said, I've been going to Reformed Baptist church since, this church has been around since 1991. It's been a solid Reformed Baptist church this whole time. But this view of 1689 Federalism just came about just around 2014. So if you were a Reformed Baptist before 2014, you most likely were not a 1689 Federalist, if you're still alive today. Now they point to many of the older Reformed Baptists from past who held to that position, but there's been no modern people until 2014. But the position before 2014 is the position that I would hold to. We didn't really have a name for it. It was just Reformed Baptist covenant theology. But now it's been called 1689 covenantalism, just to differentiate between 1689 federalism. And the big difference is just how it views the new covenant and the old covenant. It views the old covenant, all the old covenants, but specifically the Mosaic covenant, but many are kind of going to all of the old covenants as republication of the covenant of works, and that only the new covenant is the covenant of grace. And that's very distinct from a classical formulation of covenant theology. A classical formulation of covenant theology, whether Presbyterian or Reformed Baptist, has always been that covenant of grace was initiated in the Garden of Eden with Adam, and then by farther steps, through Noah and Moses, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, all those covenants were, progressive farther steps of the covenant of grace that was ultimately culminated in the new covenant. That's like the classical formulation of covenant theology. But 689 federalism teaches only the new covenant is the covenant of grace, and the old covenants, but especially the Mosaic covenants, where it started was that was republication of a covenant of works. But then it's really now saying all of the old covenant, because those covenants, it's either based on grace principle or works principle, and it's getting to the point where, so it's looking a lot more dispensational, you can say, more discontinuity. But 689 covenantalism, the view that I would hold, and many Reformed Baptists hold, would be, no, we still see the classical formulation of covenant theology.
Okay.
Which is similar to maybe a Westminster Presbyterian view, or just a classical traditional formulations.
Okay, let me ask a couple of definitionals here, because that was really helpful. I want to walk through it carefully. Okay. So you're saying 1689 federalism, 1689 covenantalism. So the way, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're presenting these as two faithful Reformed Baptist compatible, at least. It's kind of specifically, right? 1689 federalism and 1689 covenantalism. So a Reformed Baptist articulation of how the covenant works. I have heard a division between 1689 federalism and 20th century Reformed Baptist thought, or 20th century covenant Baptist thought. Is that sort of what you're saying has been mistaken for that? Okay. Right.
Yeah. So, basically whatever all the Reformed Baptists believed in the 1900s, but it's not only then. That's not I wouldn't say that's the best name for it, just because there's Reformed Baptists since the 1689 sign, few of the signers that held to it that we know for sure, and then just throughout church history, like a John Gill and others. So there's been a lot throughout church history that have held to this classical, been a Reformed Baptist that held to a classical covenant theology.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's phrased that way, because, and I'm not saying there's anything nefarious about it, but obviously words are important, right? Like these titles are important. 20th century, whether it's 20th century federalism or covenant theology or Baptist Reformed theology, it sounds like something that's a recent innovation, but you're making the case that's actually something that preceded federalism.
Yeah. Well, especially in the modern day. Now, the 689 Federalists would say, hey, we're going back to some older authors, and there are some older authors that held to it, but just, there hasn't been, no one held to it now until 2014.
Okay.
So if there's any Reformed Baptist pastor who's like 60 right now, well, he held to this classical formulation up until 10 years ago.
So what's your take? And again, I want to get back to that covenant thing and walk through kind of that overarching conception of it. But you mentioned 2014. What exactly happened in 2014 that you're kind of pegging this on? Because I'm thinking of and correct me here, Corey, if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking of current 1689 Federalist writers. You've got, I believe, both of the Renahans would fit in that camp. Richard Barcellos.
Right.
I'm trying to think of any others, but you've got a lot of very prominent Baptist writers right now that I would think would fit well within federalism. What exactly has happened?
So it it all started in 2014 with the publication of a book by Pascal Denot, Reformed Baptist pastor in France and Canada. And I think his book was called The Distinctiveness of Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology, maybe.
Okay.
But it was a publication of his dissertation. But that was like the first, that was it. And he argued for this view, and was using it as previous Reformed Baptist authors. There's a guy named Nehemiah Cox, who was a Reformed Baptist author of the past, and he seemed to articulate some of the 689 Federalist views, though the current 689 Federalism, there's still a lot of things they say that the older guys didn't say. They're still formulating some new things, but in general, they found some previous authors that held to it. But that was the book that really was that changed things.
Okay.
And for them, they would say it's a lot of the recovery of some of the older particular Baptists, Reformed Baptists,
Okay.
that they found some of their works, and by finding those works, it caused them to change their views. Because again, up until 2014, every Reformed Baptist held to the classical covenant theology view.
Okay. So looking then at that covenant structure, if I can kind of like rewind my brain a little bit here, because there's so much that plays into this, and I think it's what swamps people with covenant theology. But you're maintaining, so you've got this kind of cross-testamental Old and New Testament covenant. If I'm hearing you correct, you're saying that 1689 federalism either has a continuity-discontinuity divide between Old and New Testament, is holding to much more discontinuity than the view you're proposing, and they also would put more of a stress on the individual covenant structures of the Old Testament. Am I hearing you correctly? Whereas what you're advocating is more of a cohesive covenant of grace with an expression in the Old and New Testament?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's going to be the big differences. And I really think, I think there needs to be work done on this, but I think there's a reason that the 689 federalism faded out, because by the time dispensationalism took over, that's when 689, what is now called 689 federalism, pretty much faded out. Because there is some historical data that there were some Reformed Baptists that held to something like a 689 federalism. Now, I wouldn't say the majority, but at least there were some. But by the 1800s, there's none of that.
Okay.
I think dispensationalism is probably what did that, because it has kind of that more of that discontinuity aspect to it. But yeah, so the biggest thing is just they see the new covenant as the only covenant that's the covenant of grace.
Okay. So when you're looking at covenant theology, kind of the big spectrum of covenant theology, you're placing dispensationalism over here with much discontinuity between Old and New Testament, or Old Covenant and New Covenant. Then you've got full-blown covenant theology. We could call it foolproof covenant theology, black coffee covenant theology over here. And then in the middle, you have these other views of dispensational, progressive dispensationalism, which is, I'm not going to attempt to define it because it confuses me sometimes. And then you've got progressive covenantalism, which has been a favorite of most Baptists and many Reformed Baptists in recent years. Again, progressive covenantalism, though, as opposed to full covenant theology, stressing a little more discontinuity, and specifically when it comes to those Old Testament covenants. What's your take then on progressive covenantalism? Because that's picked up a lot of steam. You had the Kingdom Through Covenant, Gentry and Wellum pushed that. You had authored that. You had what was the follow-up that they wrote? Oh, the follow-up was just a progressive covenantalism.
Yeah, just that
which
book.
I think, Brent Parker, I think, edited that one or pulled it together.
Right.
But yeah, that has picked up a lot of steam in Baptist circles. What are you seeing there that's different from what you're proposing?
Yeah, where I've seen that pick up steam is mainly in your more Calvinistic-ish Baptist circles. So a lot of your confessionally Reformed Baptist circles, they would have never, a lot of them wouldn't have gravitated to the progressive covenantalism. Okay. And the reason is because progressive covenantalism really, it sees a little bit too much of a distinction between the old and new, that really, they don't see the Ten Commandments as the moral enduring law. And that's going to be one of the big differences between a truly Reformed Baptist view of covenant theology and progressive covenantalism. Because even with your 689 Federalists, they would still see the enduring nature of the Ten Commandments. So that's probably one of the biggest differences between.
That I would think that would be a huge one, because I know and I'm trying to remember which one it was. Baptist author that we've not mentioned yet on here. In any case, he was writing on that and made very clear the Ten Commandments had been abrogated, was his word. He kept repeating. You're saying, though, no, an abiding Ten Commandments. So again, much continuity you're seeing.
Much continuity, yeah. And progressive covenantalism, it really seemed like it flowed out of, if you remember, New Covenant theology. And if you were around when that was, sprouting up, and progressive covenantalism seems to be the later stages of that.
Okay, yeah. New Covenant theology was so hard to, it was Jello, trying to nail Jello to the wall, because there was many guys running around in that movement. And progressive covenantalism, if I remember correctly, I think Steve Wellum made very clear that they were trying to purposefully distance themselves from that and define out their view, which I think was very wise. So tell me this, Corey. So you're saying cohesive covenant of grace, Old to New Testament.
Right.
I'm assuming one people of God, one method of salvation, all of that the same. So what exactly keeps you from being Westminster at this point? Well, what's the difference there that you would suss out?
Well, I think when it comes to like just the superstructure, that the outline of the covenants, there's really not too much of a difference. So I think I would really say there's a lot of commonality. So that's why, I'm actually leading a covenant, our men's mentoring class that we have once a month. We're actually going through a covenant theology book, and we're actually using, the book's actually right here, by Richard Belcher. Let me see if you can see it. This is one book that I would definitely recommend. Richard Belcher, the fulfillment of the promises of God. Because again, the superstructure of things, we have a lot of commonality. We see ourselves within those streams. So I want to, highlight the commonality. We see the Bible through the glasses of covenants. We see all the covenants after the fall as part of the covenant of grace. We would agree on the covenant of redemption, covenant of works, covenant of grace, theologically speaking, all those redemptive theological covenants. But the big difference, it comes down to the ecclesiology, the nature of the new covenant, specifically who makes up the membership of the church in the new covenant.
Okay.
So you can say the administration of the covenant is where we would differ, but a lot of the substance, we would have similarities.
Okay. So let's suss that out a little bit, because obviously we're, dancing around the Credo Baptist, Paedo Baptist distinctive, right?
That's it. Yeah.
And you're talking about ecclesiology. So we're, as you said, we're sussing out who makes up the covenant community. So in that sense, in the trying to think of a really careful way to say this so I don't sound like I'm smearing either side, but in the makeup of the covenant community, you're saying more discontinuity in your view from, let's say, a Westminsterian covenant theology, correct?
Yeah, right.
Okay. So that covenant makeup has changed. In the same way, we would say the administration of the sign of the covenant accordingly has changed. Ergo, credo baptism and not paedo baptism in reflection of circumcision.
Right. Everybody has some sort of discontinuity when it comes to that relationship, unless you're, the Judaizers who gets heretical when you're not seeing as much of the discontinuity. So we all have some sort of discontinuity. It's just, where do we draw the line when it comes to the makeup of the membership of the church? And, you could say it's more discontinuity with the Baptists, but, I would just say it's more of a fulfillment, something that's already been fulfilled.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the organic principle. One good example is just, so God's covenantal people in the old covenant were primarily ethnic and national. Well, there's discontinuity there, because that's been fulfilled. There's still ethnic, you can say, but it's many ethnicities, right? It's still, you can say national, but not really. It's mainly the church, rather than a nation, specifically. So we see discontinuity there in the makeup. And then I think when it comes down to the church, what does that look like? And that's where the Baptists and Presbyterians will differ on how much continuity, what's been fulfilled, that's that doesn't continue. And the big one for Baptists is just a genealogical principle. So, for the Presbyterians, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but just they see the genealogical principle as still abiding. So that circumcision that was done to the children of the covenant members, in the old covenant, that now that the way that's fulfilled, or how it goes into the new covenant, is you keep the genealogical principle, but now it's by way of baptism.
Okay.
And just as Baptists, obviously, we would reject that. We would say that genealogical principle doesn't go on in that way in the New Testament. In fact, Christ is the last genealogy we get. After that, there are no more genealogies. That now that the Messiah has come, there's no purpose in that way, especially for the Jewish people. But just that genealogical principle, other passages throughout the New Testament of who are the true children of Abraham. It's not genealogical physically, it's spiritually. It's those by faith. It's the children of promise. So we would see it's just fulfilled in different ways.
Okay. So I want to push in a little bit on that because I'm curious about this one. Because I would suspect for most that are working through this, I think that might be as far as who makes up the covenant community and what that difference is, what that discontinuity is in whatever form between Old and New Testament. I think that's going to be where to push it in a little bit. But you mentioned Israel, so you would still confess, in keeping with most covenant theologies, that there is one coherent people of God, one cohesive people of God, Old to New Testament. Right. Israel in the Old, the church in the New, but it has always been one plan of salvation, mediated through Christ, both Old and New Testament.
Amen. Yeah.
Okay. So, which would be another distinction, I believe, from 1689 Federalism, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. So that's really good to know. And for those keeping up, like, these are inherently eschatological issues, right? Some of the biggest eschatological issues are the place of Israel, the place of the church, who are God's people. So all of this is playing in a big way there. With the kids, do you see then? Because really, what I'm wondering, Corey, is what exactly is the substance? Oh no, that's a theological term. What's the grit? Where's the rub with keeping the Old Testament as part of an overarching covenant of grace, if there is such a radical distinction or disjuncture between who is in the covenant of God, Old to New Testament? The makeup of the covenant people. And what I'm kind of thinking toward on that is, would you see any place in the new covenant then for children being in any sort of covenant? Maybe not the covenant of grace. Maybe you define it in a different way. I know we've heard some Baptists recently try to work through that issue, that children are in covenant but not in the covenant, that sort of thing. Any place for the children, or is this solely a work of those who are regenerate believers, members of the church? I'm assuming is right out as well, along with 1689 Federalism. Walk me into that.
Yeah, I mean, as Baptists, I'm thinking 689 covenantalism. I mean, we want it to be those by faith. So those who are children, true children of Abraham, who make up the true church, are those who, are children of the promise, who are by faith. Now, we can't see folks' hearts, so there's still something with the visible community that's going to be different from the elect. Just like how it was the continuity in the old. There's still, you have the one people of God, but you have the elect, the true regenerate, and you still have the nation though. And so, you still have some of that principle within Baptists, where, you do have, you can only see so much of the heart. So I'm thinking of the church that I pastor. The goal is that we would have regenerate church membership, that everybody who's a member of our church is a true Christian. But it may be that it's not that way. It just appears to be that way, but it may not be. So there may be some who are members of the church that aren't elect or regenerate. So you still have that aspect. And I think of as children, I mean, it's just, the Lord can save children. So there can be children a part of our membership and part of, if they profess faith and those things, and there can be children who are part of the elect and part of the covenant of grace if they, pronounce faith, profess faith. Now you still have the physical aspects of family. Children are a part of families, households. So they're still, they're under authorities in different ways within a nation. They're under those authorities. But as we think of that spiritual aspect of being in the covenant of grace, or being in the visible community, it would be, needs to be profession by faith.
Okay. So covenantal promises, or, in the form of blessings or curses extended to children and families, or solely to the professing church?
Or ask that one again.
So as far as, because I'm not trying to trap you on any of these, Corey. I'm thinking through what is the continuity that we're confessing with the covenant of grace between Old and New Testament. So I was bringing up, old covenant, you have blessings and curses, upon the whole people of God, including their children. So again, not a guarantee of election nor of right. salvation, but still there's covenant blessings and covenant curses that accompany one's membership in the covenant community. Do you see any continuity there, or is that
yeah? Well, I just seeing the church fulfill that. So rather than genealogical families being the fulfillment of it, like a nation, we would just see that the church is the fulfillment of it. So that church has all those blessings, and and that's associated with the membership of the church.
Okay.
And also curses. One of the greatest curses in the new covenant is excommunication from the body. So I would see a lot of that just being fulfilled in the church,
okay,
rather than just families within the church.
Okay. I wonder how you would sell, like, so let's just say I'm a 1689 Federalist. I've read and I'm not going to try to pronounce his name. I always say Denault, and I know that's completely wrong. Denault or something like that. Yeah. So just insert French pronunciation here. So I've read the book. I'm convinced on 1689 Federalism. I'm sold on this. Here comes Corey, and you tell me, no, there's actually one overarching covenant of grace. What is the thing to which, or what are the things to which you're pointing me to? Because if I'm hearing you right, there is still some discontinuity, right? We're seeing continuity. One of the things you'd pointed out, for example, is that Jesus mediates the covenant of old and new, as opposed to many 1689 Federalists, I think, would speak of angels mediating the old. So you've got some disjuncture in there, and yet a lot of the things do seem similarly changed or fulfilled, right? You've got a different covenant community, a different covenant sign, a lot of these things. I don't mean different disparagingly. You know what I mean? Like, there's been development. What's the thing you're selling me on here that is better with a unity of a covenant of grace within this view of 1609 covenantalism?
I mean, the biggest thing is just how we read the Bible, and just seeing that unity, and really, I'll show you this book. This book came out recently, but it's a critique of 1689 federalism, and the emphasis is, and it's written by Earl Blackburn, but the emphasis, I think, is against republicanism.
Okay.
To me, that's my biggest fear of 1689 federalism, and that's not just unique among Reformed Baptists. The Presbyterians have had to fight republicanism with Meredith Kline and a lot of the Westminster Cali guys and different churches. So republicanism, and just teaching that at least the Mosaic covenant, could be others, but the Mosaic covenant is a republication of the covenant of works. To me, that's where I have a little hesitations, and I want to talk through more of that. What does that mean? What will that lead to if you keep this, if you hold to this? And just want to emphasize the also that you need real historical covenants. I mean, and that's how God operates. For God's grace to be administered, it's got to be through real historical covenants.
Okay.
You can't say that they're, for me, it's hard to grasp to say, okay, God still saves people by grace, but all the covenants, though, are all works-based in the old covenant. But it's just through promises and looking to, but that's just, to me, that doesn't, it's not that convincing.
Okay.
So I just want to encourage just the continuity to say we need these true historical covenants. It's great to look at all the typology that they point to, and I want to do that, but we got to keep them as true historical covenants as well, and see the great benefit that they brought, and that they were true covenants of grace.
Okay. No, that's helpful, because that's, if I'm hearing you right, that it's almost more of a rear view focus, I think, is what you're talking about, looking back to the Old Testament and saying, let's not divorce those I'm trying to speak charitably to those other views, but let's not separate those out as not part of an overarching covenant of grace that God is working. Let's instead preserve those gracious aspects and not advocate something like republication that would seem to divvy that up. Am I hearing you right on that?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
and I agree with my Presbyterian brothers who have written against republicanism, and I think that republicanism is really it's not a development of Orthodox Reformed covenant theology. Instead of it's an outlier. And that's why with 689 covenantalism, the emphasis is our unity with our brothers and sisters, our Presbyterians and others. It's unity with with the whole covenant theology community, saying, we all have unity when it comes down to the very basics of what covenant theology is. And we're following that classical line. Now, when it comes to some of the outworkings of it, like with, ecclesiology, then yeah, we have some differences with different folks, but we still have this classical formulation. But I think with 689 federalism, similar to a republicanist within the Presbyterian circles, that they're it's more of a unique aspect of covenant theology rather than the classical stance.
Okay. Walk us into, because we've been chatting now for I don't even know how long, Corey, and we've got to land the plane in eschatology because this is the channel. We've already talked about some things this impacts, right? This necessarily impacts the church Israel distinction or relationship.
Sure.
And we don't need to belabor that one probably. I'm wondering how else does this impact eschatology? So you're making the case for something that is historically Baptist, or at least historically Reformed Baptist, which is historically Baptist. How then does this express itself in eschatology? I'm guessing it makes it a bit difficult to be dispensational, premillennial, if you are, confessing this view. But how do you see this playing out within eschatology and your overall cosmology?
Right. Well, I think it definitely impacts eschatology big time. And when you think covenant theology, it's the unfolding of the plan of God's redemption for his people from eternity past to eternity future. Right. So it impacts our view of the past, the present, the future. A reminder that God's in control. He's sovereign over everything. He has a plan, and it's been unfolding since the beginning of creation. Now, there's no plan Bs. There's no something might happen where God has to adjust his plan, adjust his purposes. No, everything's going according to a sovereign plan. So therefore, as we look at history, present, future, holding to covenant theology, we can't be pessimistic. We can't have fear. We can't be fretting what may come. We should have this holy optimism of the faith of God's going to fulfill his promises. His words will come, will be fulfilled. So I think whether it's a Reformed Baptist or a Presbyterian or any Reformed, covenant theologian, a believer, is that we should all have an optimistic eschatology. And it should be one, so every Baptist covenantalist should be optimistic when it comes to the end times, and not fretting, but seeing God in control, and similar to our Presbyterian covenantalists. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. Is it's more, instead of thinking of all the different views and looking at their differences, it's almost like, okay, covenant theology definitely has the optimistic view. And however, if you want to use that all-mill, post-mill, and different views of them, but it needs to be an optimistic look on the future.
Okay. So tell me this, and this might be pushing it a little bit too far, but some of the pushback that I've seen against, specifically with postmillennialism, has been that a Baptist, this has been the contention, that Baptists cannot consistently hold to a postmillennial eschatology, and typically you can think through some of the issues they're probably thinking toward there. Number one, you've got some ecclesiology issues of how can something be Christianized? To what extent can we talk about nations becoming Christian or peoples becoming Christian? So you've got that sort of part of it, but a lot of it has to do with that whole covenant structure argument. Do you see that as a view here? Or is that impacted or changed between your view of 1689 covenantalism and maybe some of the 1689 federalism, where that may seem a little more disjointed to confess 1689 federalism and yet still hold to a postmillennial eschatology? In your view, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's it. That's something that definitely needs to be further looked at, because I don't know too many 689 Federalists that would hold to postmill, but I know a lot of Baptist covenantalists or 689 covenantalists that would hold to, postmill. Our church, our founding pastor, he was post millennial. He's post millennial before it's cool back in the 90s. But but we have history of pastors being all millennial at our church as well. But yeah, I think there is something to that. I mean, I don't think there's anything different from there's nothing keeping a Reformed Baptist from being post millennial.
Okay.
I think now when you come to like old school theonomy, then that would definitely be outside of Reformed Baptist circles, outside of our confession of faith, applying Israel civil laws to nations. But it's really not too many old school theonomists around anymore. But that I would see them as some of the most foolproof, as much consistency as possible from old to new. Don't wear two different types of clothing. I had our former pastor mention, one of the he knew one of the well-known theonomists, and in California, he mentioned he had like a cookout. There's a Reformed Fellowship cookout of all the pastors, Reformed Baptists and Presbyterians, and one of the major this theonomic, one of the major proponents of theonomy back then, would only wear wool, or wouldn't wear two pieces of different clothing. So, so in that way, in our confession of faith, it's real clear that the civil laws, you're not applying those to to the nations. You just take the principles from them. But with just post mill, I mean, post mill, there's nothing there that would be contrary to a Reformed Baptist view. We would, because I was still it would just be a different look at it. Like when a Presbyterian says their family's Christian is different when a Reformed Baptist says their family's Christian. Like I would say, I have a Christian family. Well, that's going to be different from when a Presbyterian says they have a Christian family. Okay. So when a Presbyterian might say Christian nation, that might be different from what a Reformed Baptist might mean by Christian nation, if that makes sense. Okay. For a Presbyterian, most likely that means everybody in that nation is being baptized upon birth, or whatever the case may be. Well, for a Baptist, that's not what we mean by a Christian nation or Christian family. It would mean something different. But I think it could still be under under post-millennialism.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's helpful. And that's especially helpful because I know there have been some Baptist contentions recently that you can't say Christian nation nor Christian family, but we won't get sidetracked on that. Tell me this though, Corey, because we were talking a little bit. I think I don't remember if this was before the interview or not. We were talking about the abiding validity of the Mosaic, or excuse me, the Ten Commandments, right? So you've got 1689 Federalism says the Ten Commandments have been abrogated, the law. Specifically in that expression, 69 covenantalism. I'm tripping over my words at this point. 69 covenantalism, though, you're saying no, a continuing abiding validity of the law of the 10 words at least. That seems to lend, and again, I'm not trying to shoehorn it into. You mentioned old school theonomy, so we might have issue with Gary North or Rushdoony or maybe even Bonson or one of those guys. But at least in a general equity sense, let's just say some just very baseline application of God's 10 commandments in whatever form ought be enforced today. That would fit within 69 covenantalism.
Oh yeah. I mean that's what I would hold to. That's what our nation has held. I mean that's really, that's what our laws are based upon. Our history of our laws. So yeah, I mean general equity, and that's what's taught within our confession of faith, is the general equity of those laws. And
right. Well, the general equity, but specifically when you refer to the 10 commandments, if I'm understanding the 1689 correctly, we're not just arguing for a general equity, for example, of the civil or ceremonial laws. We're instead saying there is an abiding validity of the 10 commandments. It has never been abrogated. It is in fact still in force. And that would be a big difference between the 1689 Federalist and Covenantalist interpretation of that. Is that correct?
Okay. Well, I think the 1689 Federalists, I think they would still say that there's the moral abiding law. Their language might be a little bit different on what that actually looks like, but I think it's more of the progressive covenantalism and the new covenant that would abrogate the 10 commandments. But the 1689 Federalists, from what I'm aware of, they still keep the moral enduring law.
Okay.
The 10 commandments.
Yeah, certainly. I don't want to misspeak for anybody. And you do have a little bit of wordplay there, because something can be abiding
Yeah.
in nature. So you can say God always holds murder to be wrong, and yet for you to say that God said in the Ten Commandments that it's wrong and that command
Right.
applies to you today,
Right.
it sounds the same, but it's a bit different. But anyway, Corey, who should people be reading on this view? Are you do you have like-minded brothers that are writing in this area? Where can people kind of learn more of this, or maybe even maybe older works? I know you mentioned Nehemiah Cox. Where can people be reading up on what you've been
Yeah,
proposing?
I think I mean, to me, when it comes to just classical covenant theology, I think we should all read the best, which is, before the 1600s is going to be your Presbyterians. So, I think the Reformed Baptists, I mean, we're seeing ourselves within that lineage. It's not like I think with the 689 Federalists and some other Reformed Baptists, they just want to, you know, make too much of a distinction, like, oh, we can't read those things. Like there's everything about it is wrong. Even the substance of it is where, paedobaptism comes from. So we can't, the whole system has to be thrown out because of the paedobaptism. And the 689 covenantalists, we're saying, no, 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 the system is great. This is wonderful. It's true. It's biblical. Now, some of the application, administering of it, we might have some differences, but the substance of it is really good. So I would encourage brothers to read the great works of old on covenant theology, but then also just some newer things. I mean, there's for my Reformed Baptist brothers, I would encourage them to read this critique of 1689 federalism, because 1689 federalism has become somewhat popular in the last 10 years just because a lot of the publications that have been coming out on it. There's another book on the Introduction to Covenant Theology by Earl Blackburn, Walt Chantry. That was done, about 10 years ago or so. That's like a Reformed Baptist distinctive of covenant theology. So those are a few recent resources. But I think you just, a lot of the classical understandings, you just go to classical formulations of those who have taught covenant theology, last few centuries.
Okay. Very good. And you're on the Twitter or the
Yeah,
X
yeah.
rather?
Yeah, so I'm on X and can't remember my handle. Maybe I'm a little spicy out there, but I'm on there usually for usually some things on covenant theology, a lot of Reformed Baptist covenant theology, and then also, because I'm in the SBC, some of the SBC things, but really just
Spice is the only reason people get on Twitter, so you don't have to apologize for that, Corey.
I
That's
know.
why people
Yeah,
are
yeah,
there. They're there for the
yeah.
spice.
That's right. It's good for that. I mean, I think, I'm not on any other social media actually. I mean, because I think, I actually do like Twitter and how, I mean, that's really a great way to get news. I mean, it's hard to get news quicker than X. I mean, I can't, you can get that quicker. And I found there's just a lot of encouragement. I know a lot of people talk about the discouragement on X, but maybe just how my feed is or who I'm following. I mean, I guess I'm not following any crazy folks, so I'm
The
usually
algorithm has favored you, huh?
yeah, it's favored me. So I'm usually encouraged and it's a great place for something like this. It's a great place for
Right.
some not debate, but just throwing out ideas and maybe having some input out there. But this is way better,
Right. Yep.
having this fuller podcast and discussion. You can only do so much on X. I mean,
Absolutely.
when it gets to you can't have too long of discussions on there.
Well, you shouldn't anyway. You probably need to hang up the keyboard at that point. No, Corey, do me a favor. Shoot me in an email just those links. We'll make sure to post those on our show notes and everything like that, and have those on there for those books you mentioned. But Corey, this has been fascinating, brother. I appreciate you coming on and chatting with us.
Yeah, man, really enjoyed it. It's great meeting you. Hopefully we can, stick together, keep in touch, and I'll be looking out for the podcast too. I'll be looking at Eschatology Matters and trying to look at y'all's old stuff. One thing I want to mention, and this doesn't have to go to the podcast, but I've seen a lot of folks within the last 10 years who were Reformed Baptists, but because of 1689 federalism, it's actually caused them to go Paedo-Baptist. There's been some prominent figures, but and the reason is they thought that it was the only view out there. Because if they came into the Reformed Baptist circles post 2014, because there's not much written, there's not much publications on just the, plain vanilla Reformed Baptist covenant theology view. if they became Reformed Baptists after 2014, then possibly all they know of is possibly 689 Federalism, unless they're part of a church that's been around longer than 2014. That's Reformed Baptist.
Okay. Yeah.
If you're not part of that, then all you might know is the 689 Federalism route. So I've had some people, many that have, a few that have gone over, but then some that were about to, and I've gotten to talk to and discuss and just letting them know about the other view, and it's really kept them. They're saying, "Oh, okay, there is." I thought the only way to be Reformed Baptist was you had to have this really wonky view of covenant theology, and the whole old covenant of works, new covenants, covenant of grace, like just something that goes against their theological senses. And when I've come beside those brothers, it's like, no, your theological senses were right. There is this, the classical formulation of covenant theology is true, and working through that with them. So
okay, no, that's helpful, and that in and of itself could be a whole topic that we can talk through. But no, again, Corey, thanks so much, and yeah, hope we can chat again.
Yeah, man, enjoyed it.
Seated here at my right hand, the